In this session, we are going to describe the division of the anterior triangle into 4 triangles and the boundaries and contents of each of these triangles. In this diagram, you can see the superficial veins of the neck after removal of the skin. Those veins, the superficial veins, are the common facial vein, which is formed by the anterior division of the retromandibular vein and the facial vein, and come to end in the internal jugular vein. That is the internal jugular vein here. The external jugular vein, which is formed by the posterior division of the retromandibular with the posterior auricular vein, forming the external jugular vein, which will end in the subclavian vein. And these are the 2 anterior jugular veins here, which will unite to form the jugular arch. That is the subclavian vein here, where the external jugular will terminate. And that is the jugular arch, which usually terminate into the internal jugular or the innominate vein. Next to the superficial fascia of the neck, this is the cervical fascia. Cervical fascia is formed of more than 1 layer of deep fascia. The most superficial of it, or the most anterior to it, better to say, is the investing layer of the deep fascia, which will split into 2 layers laterally to enclose the sternocleidomastoid, then reunite to form the roof of the posterior triangle. Split again to enclose the trapezius muscle and end in the spines of the cervical vertebrae. That is the first layer or the first type of deep fascia in the neck. The second one is what we call it the prevertebral fascia. That prevertebral fascia, which surrounds the muscles around the vertebrae, the anterior one and the posterior one. That is the what we call it the prevertebral fascia. It splits here in 2 layers to enclose what we call it retropharyngeal space. That is the retropharyngeal space. So that is the second type of deep fascia. The third type is what we call it the visceral layer, the visceral fascia, formed of 2 parts. The carotid sheaths, which surround the common carotid, then the internal carotid with the internal jugular and the vagus nerve, and the pretracheal fascia, which will surround the trachea down and then go up to split to surround the thyroid gland and end in the attachment to the oblique line of thyroid cartilage. So these are the 3 groups of the deep fascia: the investing layer, the prevertebral layer, and the visceral layer. That is the fascia of the neck. Now, in the neck, there is some structures in the middle line of the neck which we have to know them during examining any patient to know if there is any anomalies, if there is any swellings or whatever in the middle line. So it starts up by the symphysis mentae, the meeting of the 2 halves of the body of the mandible. Then the submental lymph nodes, a group of lymph nodes will be in the middle line just below the mandible. Then the mylohyoid raphe, which is the meeting point between the 2 mylohyoid muscles on each side, forming a fibrous raphe between the mandible and the hyoid bone. Then the body of the hyoid bone will be in the middle line. Then the infrahyoid bursa, which is formed between the thyroid membrane, which reaches the upper border of the hyoid bone to be attached to it, creating a bursa between the thyroid membrane and the body of the hyoid bone. So that is the thyroid membrane, which goes, as we said, to the upper border of the body of the hyoid. Then the thyroid notch, which we call it Adam's apple, which is more prominent in male than in female. Then followed by the cricothyroid membrane, that is the thyroid cartilage here, and this is the cricoid cartilage over here. So that is the cricothyroid membrane. then the cricoid cartilage itself, then the cricotracheal membrane between the cricoid and the first tracheal ring, then the first tracheal ring itself, then the isthmus of thyroid gland, which lies in front of the second, third, and fourth tracheal rings, then the jugular arch, which we have seen it uniting or connecting the two anterior jugular veins, followed by the suprasternal notch, that is the structures in the middle line of the neck. Now we are going to the anterior triangle of the neck to describe its boundaries and its divisions. So the anterior triangle is divided in 4 triangles. The carotid, number 1, the digastric, the second, the third is the submental, and lastly the fourth is the muscular triangle. These are the 4 triangles of the neck. The sternocleidomastoid is the muscle which divides the neck into anterior triangle and posterior triangle. We have described the posterior triangle. The anterior triangle would be posteriorly the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid, above the base of the mandible, anteriorly the middle line of the neck. This anterior triangle is redivided into 4 triangles: the carotid, the digastric, the submental, and the muscular triangle. Let's start by the important one, which is the carotid triangle. Its boundaries, that is the carotid triangle here, its boundaries behind the upper half of the sternocleidomastoid, in front and above the posterior belly of the digastric, in front and below will be the superior belly of the omohyoid. The floor of that triangle is formed of, in front, the hypoglossus, below, in front and below, will be the thyrohyoid, behind and above will be the middle constrictor, behind and below will be the inferior constrictor. That is the boundaries of the carotid triangle. Now for the contents of the carotid triangle. The upper part of the common carotid artery will be there, the upper part of the external carotid, and the upper part of the internal carotid. The common carotid will divide at the upper border of the thyroid cartilage to or into the external carotid and the internal carotid. So the upper part of this common carotid will be there, and then the upper part of the external carotid, the upper part of the internal carotid, then the internal jugular vein. Those arteries, the common carotid, the internal carotid, and the internal jugular are found in the carotid sheath with the vagus nerve. The sympathetic trunk is there embedded in the posterior wall of the carotid sheath. The hypoglossal nerve is there, which will be connected to the ans cervicalis. Branches of the external carotid artery in the carotid triangle are 5 branches, which are the superior thyroid, the ascendopharyngeal, the lingual, the facial, and the occipital arteries. With them, the spinal part of accessory will be there. The terminal part of those veins, the common facial, the lingual, the superior thyroid, all will end in the internal jugular vein. Then branches of the superior laryngeal nerve will be there. In this cadaveric specimen, we are going to see the contents of the carotid triangle, most of them. That is the occipital artery here, as being crossed by the hypoglossal nerve. Above, the occipital artery also can be seen here, above the level of the hypoglossal crossing. That is the internal carotid, and that is the external carotid. This is the common carotid. So the occipital artery, the facial artery over here, and as it reaches the face, that is the facial artery, the second branch here. Then the lingual artery being crossed, it forms a loop here, crossed by the hypoglossal nerve, and then the superior thyroid artery. These are 4 branches. The 5th branch comes from the medial side of the external carotid artery, cannot be seen in that specimen. Here you can see the external carotid, as I said. This is the internal carotid. You can see the hypoglossal as it crosses the occipital and crosses the lingual arteries. And this is the vagus nerve here within the carotid sheath. The internal jugular should be a bit lateral here, but it's covered by part of the sternomastoid. Now, that is the digastric triangle. This is the digastric here. The boundaries are from above the lower part of the mandible, below and in front will be the anterior belly of the digastric, that is the anterior belly here. Below and behind is the posterior belly of the digastric and the stylohyoid muscle. The floor is formed by anteriorly the mylohyoid, posteriorly the hyoglossus. The contents of that triangle, actually more posterior part of the middle constrictor may appear in the floor of the digastric triangle. The contents of that triangle, mainly the submandibular gland, the submandibular lymph nodes, the facial artery as we have seen it in the previous cadaveric specimen, the facial vein, the hypoglossal nerve as it goes to lie between the mylohyoid and the hyoglossus, the submental artery, the mylohyoid nerve and vessels on the surface of the mylohyoid and part of the parotid gland. Together, part of the carotid sheath and its contents can appear in the digastric triangle, part of the external carotid also. Now, the third triangle is the submental triangle. Its boundaries are in front will be the symphysis mentae here, that's in front. On each side will be the anterior belly of the digastric, this one. Behind or the base will be the body of the hyoid bone. These are the boundaries of this submental triangle. The floor is formed part of the mylohyoid muscle as they meet each other in the middle line, forming the medial raphe as we have seen them in a previous diagram. The contents are the submental lymph nodes, the submental veins, which will unite to form the anterior jugular vein. Now the last triangle is the muscular triangle. Its boundaries are in front, the middle line of the neck, behind and above the superior belly of the hyoid, behind and below the lower half of the sternocleidomastoid. The contents of this triangle are mainly or only the infrahyoid muscles. That's all about the anterior triangle of the neck, its divisions, and the contents of each triangle. Thank you.